Somewhere beyond the bright waters of the Nile, beyond the green fields where farmers slowly worked beneath the warm sun, there was a quiet place hidden among the desert hills. It was a place most people never saw. A place where the wind moved gently across stone cliffs. A place where footsteps disappeared into dust. And deep inside those silent hills, royal tombs slowly came to life. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, imagine walking through that ancient landscape. The sun has not yet risen. The air is cool. The desert sky is still dark blue, holding on to the last moments of night. Far away, a small village sleeps. The houses are simple. Their walls are made from mud bricks dried beneath the Egyptian sun. Their roofs are flat. Small clay lamps burn softly inside a few homes where early risers are already awake. This village is not filled with kings. It is not filled with priests. It is not filled with wealthy nobles. Instead, it is home to workers. Ordinary men. Skilled hands. Patient craftsmen. People whose names would mostly disappear from history. Yet these workers were responsible for creating some of the most remarkable royal tombs the ancient world would ever know. Long before the first rays of sunlight touched the desert cliffs, one worker slowly opened his eyes. His sleeping mat rested on a simple floor. The room was small. The air carried the faint smell of baked clay and old wood. For a moment he remained still. Outside, everything was quiet. No carts. No cuts. Only the distant sound of wind brushing against stone. Eventually he sat up. His workday would begin soon. Like many workers in this village, his life followed a familiar rhythm. The days changed. The seasons changed. The kings changed. But the rhythm remained much the same. He washed his face using a small container of water. Nearby, his wife prepared a simple morning meal. Bread. Perhaps some onions. Maybe a few dates. Nothing luxurious. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to begin another day. The workers who built royal tombs lived better than many ordinary laborers in Egypt. They were skilled specialists. The government understood their value. A royal tomb could not be entrusted to just anyone. The walls needed careful decoration. The passages needed precise measurements. The inscriptions needed perfect accuracy. Mistakes could not easily be hidden beneath stone. Because of this, the workers received supplies from the state. Grain. Beer. Vegetables. Clothing. Sometimes additional goods. Their lives were not wealthy, but they were often more stable than many people living elsewhere in Egypt. As dawn slowly arrived, the village began to awaken. Doors opened. Voices drifted into the morning air. Children moved through narrow pathways between homes. A few dogs wandered lazily through the settlement. The first sunlight appeared above the horizon. The desert cliffs began to glow with soft shades of gold. Soon the workers gathered together. Some carried tools. Others carried food for the day ahead. Many had performed the same journey hundreds of times before. The path led toward the royal tombs. Toward the hidden valleys where kings prepared for eternity. The walk itself became part of daily life. The workers knew every rock. Every bend in the path. Every shadow cast by the cliffs. They moved steadily through the landscape. The desert was beautiful in its own quiet way. There were no forests here. No wide fields. Only stone. Sand. Sky. And silence. As the sun climbed higher, the valley gradually revealed itself. The cliffs rose around them like enormous walls. Their pale surfaces reflected the morning light. From a distance, the valley appeared almost empty. But hidden within the rock were tunnels, chambers, corridors, and unfinished spaces waiting for skilled hands. This was where the workers spent much of their lives. Far from royal palaces. Far from grand ceremonies. Far from public attention. A king might receive glory, but the workers provided the craftsmanship. Upon arriving, each man knew his role. Some were stone cutters. Some were plasterers. Some mixed pigments for paint. Others carefully drew scenes across walls. Each task required experience. Each task required patience. Inside the tombs, conditions could be difficult. The air often felt warm and still. Natural sunlight rarely reached the deepest chambers. Workers relied upon oil lamps. Their small flames flickered against stone surfaces. Shadows danced across unfinished walls. The sounds inside were different from the outside world. A hammer striking stone. The scrape of tools. Quiet conversations. The movement of feet through narrow passages. Hour after hour these sounds echoed through the darkness. One artist slowly prepared a wall. Its surface needed to be smooth before decoration could begin. Nearby, another worker sketched guidelines. Everything followed careful planning. The ancient Egyptians believed deeply in order. Balance mattered. Symmetry mattered. Accuracy mattered. Nothing inside a royal tomb happened by accident. The images decorating the walls carried enormous importance. They told stories. They showed religious scenes. They guided the king into the next life. For that reason, every figure needed proper proportions. Every symbol needed correct placement. The workers understood these responsibilities. Many of them had spent years learning their craft. Knowledge passed from experienced workers to younger apprentices. Generation after generation. Father to son. Master to student. The skills survived because people patiently taught one another. Outside, the desert sun continued its slow journey across the sky. Inside the tomb, the workers remained focused. Time moved differently underground. The bright world outside felt distant. Only the work existed. Only the stone. Only the careful progress of another day. Yet despite the seriousness of their responsibilities, these workers were still ordinary people. They laughed. They argued. They worried about their families. They became tired. They became hungry. They shared stories during breaks. They discussed village matters. Sometimes they complained about supplies arriving late. Sometimes they worried about officials. Sometimes they simply talked about everyday life. History often remembers kings. But villages remember people. And among these workers, friendships slowly formed across years of shared labor. Men who worked side by side for decades came to know one another well. They watched each other's children grow. They celebrated births. They mourned deaths. Their lives became deeply connected. As the afternoon approached, the air inside the tomb grew warmer. Oil lamps continued burning. Stone dust settled onto clothing. The workers pressed onward. Every small section completed brought the tomb closer to readiness. Closer to becoming an eternal resting place. Closer to fulfilling its sacred purpose. And as another long day moved toward evening, none of the workers could know that thousands of years later, people across the world would still marvel at the tombs they were building. The kings would become famous. The treasures would attract attention. The monuments would inspire wonder. Yet hidden behind all of that stood the workers. The patient craftsmen. The stonecutters. The painters. The ordinary people whose daily lives unfolded quietly beneath the desert cliffs. And as the sun slowly began sinking beyond the western horizon, their workday approached its end. But tomorrow would bring another journey. Another walk through the valley. Another chapter in the slow creation of a royal tomb. And among the workers returning home that evening was a young apprentice whose life was only beginning to unfold inside this remarkable village. His story, and the story of the community around him, would shape everything that came next. The young apprentice walked home with the others as the evening light slowly faded from the desert cliffs. The path back to the village was familiar, yet every day it seemed slightly different. The shadows stretched longer now. The rocks glowed with deep shades of gold and orange. A gentle breeze drifted across the valley, carrying away some of the heat that had settled over the land during the afternoon. Around him, the older workers moved at an unhurried pace. No one rushed. There would be another workday tomorrow. There would be more stone to cut. More walls to smooth. More paintings to complete. The apprentice listened quietly as the experienced craftsmen talked among themselves. One man discussed a tool that needed repair. Another spoke about grain deliveries expected later in the week. Someone mentioned a family celebration planned for the next rest day. Their conversations were ordinary. Simple. Human. And that was often how life unfolded in the workers' village. History would later remember royal tombs and powerful rulers. Yet most days were filled with small concerns and everyday routines. As darkness approached, the village gradually came into view. Small houses stood clustered together against the edge of the desert. Thin trails of smoke rose into the evening air. Children played in the narrow pathways between homes. A few women sat outside talking quietly while preparing food. The apprentice felt a sense of comfort whenever he returned here. The village was isolated from much of Egypt. Many people elsewhere would never visit this place. Yet for the workers and their families, it was home. A safe and familiar world. When he reached his family's house, the smell of fresh bread greeted him. His mother had already begun preparing the evening meal. Inside, the room was modest but comfortable. Mud brick walls helped keep the interior cooler during hot days. Simple wooden stools sat near a low table. Clay jars stored water and food supplies. Nothing seemed grand. Nothing seemed luxurious. Yet every object had its purpose. The apprentice sat down and stretched his tired legs. His hands still carried traces of stone dust. Tiny grains clung to his skin. They seemed almost impossible to remove completely. For many workers, stone dust became a constant companion. It settled onto clothing, into hair, onto tools, into homes. The work followed them everywhere. As evening deepened, families throughout the village gathered for meals. Bread remained one of the most important foods. It appeared almost every day. Alongside it might be vegetables, dried fish, beans, or dates. Beer was also common. Ancient Egyptian beer was not exactly like modern beer. It served as an important source of nutrition and was consumed regularly by adults and children alike. After eating, many villagers spent time outside. The heat of the day gradually disappeared. The night air felt pleasant. Above them stretched a sky filled with stars. Without modern lights, the heavens appeared bright and endless. The apprentice often looked upward during these evenings. The stars seemed so numerous that counting them would be impossible. Ancient Egyptians watched the sky carefully. The movement of stars carried meaning. The annual flooding of the Nile followed natural cycles connected to the heavens. Religious beliefs were also tied closely to the sky. For many workers, the stars served as both practical guides and sacred symbols. As the village settled into quiet conversation, older craftsmen sometimes shared stories. The apprentice enjoyed listening. Some stories described famous kings. Others told of great building projects from generations earlier. A few mixed history and legend together so completely that separating them became difficult. But whether every detail was true hardly mattered. The stories connected the community to its past. One elderly stonecutter often spoke about the importance of patience. He claimed that stone itself taught lessons. "You cannot hurry rock," he would say. "If you strike too quickly, it breaks the wrong way." The apprentice remembered those words. Inside the tombs, patience truly mattered. Every mistake cost time. Every careless action left lasting consequences. A wall damaged today might require days of repair. A carving placed incorrectly could ruin weeks of work. Gradually, the village grew quieter. Families returned indoors. Lamps flickered behind doorways. Children fell asleep. Even the dogs settled down. The apprentice lay upon his sleeping mat. His body felt tired from the day's labor. Yet his thoughts remained active. Tomorrow he would return to the tomb. Tomorrow he would learn something new. Every day offered another lesson. Sometimes the lesson involved tools. Sometimes it involved painting. Sometimes it involved understanding the expectations of master craftsmen. Learning happened slowly. Year after year. No one became an expert overnight. Far away, the royal tomb remained hidden within the valley. Even now, work continued in some sections. Certain craftsmen occasionally stayed later than others. Deadlines existed. Royal expectations existed. The project could not remain unfinished forever. A king expected his eternal home to be ready when needed. That responsibility rested upon many shoulders. The apprentice eventually drifted into sleep. And before long, another morning arrived. The village awakened once more beneath the first pale light of dawn. The routine repeated. Workers prepared for the day. Tools were gathered. Meals were packed. Groups formed along the pathways leading toward the valley. The apprentice joined them. Today, however, would be slightly different. One of the master artists had agreed to allow him closer observation during the painting process. For a young apprentice, this was an important opportunity. Painting inside royal tombs required remarkable skill. The colors themselves demanded careful preparation. Pigments came from various natural materials. Red could be produced from iron-rich minerals. Yellow came from other earth pigments. Black often came from soot. White could be created using limestone. Blue, one of the most treasured colors, sometimes required more complex materials. These pigments were carefully ground into fine powders, then mixed into usable paint. Nothing was wasted unnecessarily. Materials required effort to obtain. Inside the tomb, the apprentice watched closely. The master artist worked with calm precision. First came the outline. Simple lines appeared across the wall. Gradually figures emerged. Human forms. Sacred symbols. Scenes connected to the afterlife. The apprentice noticed how steady the artist's hand remained. Years of experience showed in every movement. The artist rarely hesitated. He understood exactly where each line belonged. Nearby, another craftsman prepared plaster. Elsewhere, stonecutters continued expanding unfinished corridors. The tomb functioned almost like a living organism. Many specialists worked simultaneously. Each depended upon the others. If one stage fell behind, other tasks could not proceed. Organization became essential. The government officials overseeing the project kept records of nearly everything. Ancient Egypt loved records. Lists of workers. Lists of supplies. Lists of absences. Lists of completed tasks. Scribes carefully documented daily life within the workers' community. Because of those records, historians thousands of years later would learn surprising details about these ancient people. Sometimes records noted that a worker missed a day because he was ill. Sometimes because of family matters. Sometimes because he needed to repair his house. The workers were not nameless shadows. They were individuals with lives that occasionally entered the written record. As midday approached, work paused briefly. The men sat together in areas offering whatever shade could be found. Food was shared. Conversations resumed. Laughter occasionally echoed through the valley. The apprentice listened more than he spoke. He enjoyed hearing experienced workers discuss projects completed long ago. One painter described a tomb he had worked on during his youth. Another remembered an especially difficult section of stone that had taken weeks to shape properly. Every worker carried memories. Every worker contributed a small piece to the larger story. The apprentice began realizing something important. The royal tomb was not built by a single person, nor by a handful of famous names. It emerged through thousands upon thousands of careful actions. One stone cut at a time. One brush stroke at a time. One workday at a time. The process seemed endless. Yet slowly, almost invisibly, progress continued. And while the young apprentice focused on learning his craft, events beyond the village were beginning to shift. Changes within the royal court. Changes among powerful officials. Changes that would eventually reach even this quiet settlement in the desert. But for now, the workers knew only their daily routine. The sun continued its journey overhead. Tools continued striking stone. Paint continued covering walls. And deep within the hidden valley, another chapter of their remarkable lives quietly unfolded. The days continued to pass with the steady rhythm that had shaped life in the workers' village for generations. Morning followed morning. The sun rose above the eastern horizon. The workers gathered their tools. The familiar path wound through the desert. And once again, they entered the valley where royal tombs slowly took shape beneath the stone hills. For the young apprentice, each week seemed to bring new lessons. He no longer felt quite as uncertain as he had during his first days. His hands had grown stronger. His movements had become more confident. He understood the routines better now. He knew where supplies were stored. He knew which craftsmen preferred silence while working and which enjoyed conversation. He knew how the lamps were prepared and how tools were cleaned at the end of the day. Small pieces of knowledge accumulated slowly, like grains of sand gathering into a dune. One morning, shortly after arriving at the tomb, the apprentice noticed several workers examining a section of rock near a newly cut corridor. The stone looked ordinary enough. Yet the master stonecutters studied it carefully. They touched its surface. They tapped it gently. They listened. To an outsider, the scene might have appeared strange. But experienced workers understood something important. Not all stone behaved the same way. Some sections were solid and reliable. Others contained hidden cracks. A single mistake could cause a larger break than intended. Such accidents created extra work. Sometimes they damaged areas that had already been completed. Patience remained one of the most valuable skills inside the valley. The apprentice watched as one master carefully marked the rock. No loud instructions were needed. The older craftsmen understood their tasks. Their cooperation had been built over years of shared labor. A few measured strokes followed. Small pieces of stone fell away. The work continued. Slowly. Steadily. Without hurry. Beyond the work areas, the valley remained quiet. The cliffs stood motionless beneath the sun. Occasionally a bird crossed the sky overhead. A desert breeze drifted through the narrow spaces between rocks. Otherwise, the landscape seemed almost timeless. It was easy to imagine that nothing ever changed here. Yet change was always present. The tomb itself was changing every day. Corridors grew longer. Walls became smoother. Paintings expanded across chambers. Empty spaces transformed into sacred places. And the workers themselves changed as well. Children became apprentices. Apprentices became craftsmen. Craftsmen became masters. Masters eventually grew old. Life moved forward even when it appeared still. During one afternoon break, the apprentice sat beside an elderly painter who had spent most of his life decorating royal tombs. The man's hair had long since turned gray. His hands showed signs of decades of labor. Yet his eyes remained sharp. Very sharp. He noticed details others missed. The apprentice admired him greatly. The old painter often spoke quietly. Never loudly. Never dramatically. On this particular afternoon, he began describing his early years in the village. "When I was your age," he said softly, "I thought the kings built these tombs." The apprentice smiled. It sounded like something a child might believe. The old man smiled too. "But after many years," he continued, "I learned something else." He paused for a moment. "The kings provide the purpose. The workers provide the life." The apprentice considered those words carefully. They stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Because there was truth in them. A royal tomb might belong to a king. Yet countless workers poured pieces of their own lives into its creation. Years of effort. Years of skill. Years of patience. Their fingerprints touched every wall. Their labor shaped every chamber. Without them, the tomb would remain nothing more than an idea. As the afternoon stretched onward, the apprentice returned to work. Today he helped prepare surfaces for painting. The task seemed simple at first. Yet every stage required attention. The wall had to be smooth. Not perfectly smooth, but smooth enough for artists to work comfortably. Imperfections could affect the final appearance of the artwork. Small flaws became larger problems later. So workers addressed them early. This careful attention to detail appeared everywhere. The Egyptians valued order. Order brought harmony. Harmony reflected the proper balance of the world. Even within a hidden tomb, those beliefs guided decisions. As the hours passed, the apprentice found himself studying the paintings more closely. Many depicted the king standing before gods. Others showed journeys through the afterlife. Some included offerings of food, drink, and gifts. The images carried meaning far beyond decoration. The ancient Egyptians believed these scenes helped protect and guide the king after death. Words and images possessed power. A painted loaf of bread was not merely a picture. It represented sustenance. A painted servant represented service. A painted boat represented travel. Everything served a purpose. Nothing existed without reason. Meanwhile, life continued in the village. Women managed households. Children played in narrow streets. Meals were prepared. Clothing was repaired. Water was carried. Just as the workers followed daily routines inside the valley, their families followed routines at home. The village depended upon everyone's efforts. One evening, after returning from work, the apprentice helped his father repair part of their roof. The mud brick house had endured many seasons. Strong sunlight, occasional rain, and the passage of time all left their marks. Maintenance never truly ended. As they worked together beneath the fading sky, the apprentice asked questions about the past. His father had spent many years as a craftsman before him. He remembered projects that younger workers had never seen. He remembered masters who were now gone. He remembered times when supplies arrived late and times when work moved especially quickly. The stories flowed naturally. Not like formal history. Not like lessons. Simply memories shared between father and son. That night, after the repairs were finished, the village settled into its usual calm. The stars appeared one by one. The desert cooled. Conversations drifted through the darkness. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple tune on a flute. The sound carried gently through the night air. Soft. Unhurried. Peaceful. The apprentice listened from outside his home. Moments like this were easy to overlook. Yet they formed the foundation of daily life. Not every memory involved great events. Most lives consisted of ordinary evenings. Ordinary meals. Ordinary conversations. And perhaps that was what made them meaningful. Days later, a new shipment of supplies arrived at the village. Such arrivals always attracted attention. Workers gathered to help unload goods. Scribes carefully recorded everything. Nothing escaped documentation. The Egyptians loved records almost as much as they loved order. Grain sacks were counted. Tools were inspected. Materials were distributed. The process followed established procedures developed over many years. For the apprentice, watching the scribes remained fascinating. They seemed to transform everyday events into permanent history. A shipment arrived. A worker missed a day. A tool required replacement. Everything could be written down. Everything could become part of the record. Few people realized that thousands of years later, those records would provide rare glimpses into their world. Historians would learn about arguments, illnesses, celebrations, and shortages. The workers left behind more than tombs. They left behind traces of daily life. As another week passed, the apprentice received a new responsibility. Small at first. Nothing grand. But important. One of the master craftsmen allowed him to assist with preliminary sketches on a wall section. His hand trembled slightly when he began. Not from fear exactly. From awareness. He understood the importance of the task. The lines needed accuracy. Steadiness. Care. The master watched quietly. Correcting mistakes. Offering advice. Teaching through patience rather than anger. By the end of the day, the apprentice felt exhausted, yet satisfied. He had taken another step forward. Another small movement along a path that many craftsmen had followed before him. Outside, the valley glowed beneath the evening sun. The cliffs cast long shadows across the ground. The workers gathered their belongings. Another workday had ended. Another piece of the tomb had been completed. And while life inside the village appeared calm and predictable, distant events beyond the desert were slowly beginning to affect the kingdom. Rumors were starting to travel. Whispers from officials. News carried by travelers. changes that seemed far away for now. Yet those changes would eventually reach the workers' quiet community. And when they did, the lives of the tomb builders would become more complicated than ever before. But on this evening, none of that had arrived yet. The workers simply walked home beneath the golden light, following the familiar path through the desert, unaware of what the coming months would bring. The following morning arrived quietly. A pale glow appeared along the eastern horizon, spreading slowly across the desert landscape. The stars faded one by one, surrendering the sky to another day. In the workers' village, doors began to open. Clay lamps were extinguished. Families stirred awake. The familiar rhythm continued. For the young apprentice, mornings no longer felt unusual. The journey to the valley had become part of his life, as natural as breathing. He rose before sunrise. He ate a simple meal of bread and dates. He gathered his tools. And, along with dozens of other craftsmen, he began the walk toward the royal tomb. The desert was cool at this hour. For a short time each morning, before the heat arrived, the landscape felt gentle and welcoming. Footsteps crunched softly against gravel. Voices remained low. Many workers saved their energy for the long hours ahead. As they approached the valley, the cliffs gradually emerged from the morning shadows. Towering walls of stone surrounded the narrow pathways. The apprentice often felt a sense of wonder when he entered this place. Not because it was beautiful in an obvious way. It was not filled with green trees or flowing water. Its beauty came from silence. From stillness. From the feeling that the cliffs had been standing there forever. The valley seemed older than memory itself. Older than kings. Older than stories. And hidden within those ancient rocks were the tombs that consumed so much of the workers' lives. When work began that day, the apprentice found himself assigned to a team helping prepare a newly excavated chamber. The room was still rough. The walls showed marks left by stonecutters. Dust covered much of the floor. Before artists could begin decorating the space, many stages of preparation had to be completed. The process required patience. Everything required patience. One worker inspected the walls. Another removed loose fragments of rock. Others carried debris away. The chamber slowly became cleaner. More orderly. Closer to its final form. Nearby, experienced stonecutters continued extending another corridor deeper into the hillside. Their tools echoed faintly through the tomb. Tap. Scrape. Tap. Scrape. The sounds blended into a steady rhythm. Over the years, workers became so accustomed to these noises that silence sometimes felt stranger. For the apprentice, the sounds represented progress. Every strike brought the project forward. Every completed section added another piece to the larger design. The royal tomb was like a puzzle assembled over many years. No single worker could complete it alone, and contributed a small part. Together, those contributions created something extraordinary. As the morning passed, the apprentice noticed a group of scribes entering the work area. Their arrival always attracted attention. The scribes carried writing materials and tablets. They moved carefully through the tomb, recording information about ongoing work. Ancient Egypt depended heavily on record keeping. Officials wanted to know what materials had been used. What tasks had been completed. Which workers were present. Which workers were absent. The scribes documented everything. Sometimes they even recorded complaints. If workers believed supplies were insufficient, officials might hear about it through written reports. If disagreements occurred, records could preserve those events as well. The apprentice watched one scribe carefully noting information beside a wall. His brush moved smoothly across the surface. Years of practice showed in every movement. Writing itself was a specialized skill. Not everyone could become a scribe. Those who mastered it often enjoyed respected positions within society. The apprentice occasionally wondered what it would be like to spend his days writing instead of cutting stone or preparing walls. Yet he always returned to the same conclusion. He preferred working with his hands. He enjoyed seeing physical progress. A blank wall transformed into artwork. A rough corridor transformed into a finished passage. Those changes brought satisfaction. As midday approached, workers gathered for a break. The heat outside had become intense. Sunlight poured into the valley from above. The pale cliffs reflected brightness in every direction. Most workers sought shade whenever possible. The apprentice sat beside several older craftsmen. As they ate, conversation turned toward a topic that often appeared during breaks. Supplies. Specifically, grain deliveries. Grain formed the foundation of daily life. Bread depended upon grain. Beer depended upon grain. Without reliable deliveries, the village faced difficulties. One worker mentioned that recent shipments seemed slightly delayed. Another nodded. A third shrugged. Small concerns like these appeared regularly. Sometimes they disappeared quickly. Sometimes they grew into larger problems. For now, no one seemed especially worried. The discussion drifted toward other subjects. Families. Repairs. Upcoming religious festivals. The simple matters that filled ordinary lives. After the break, work resumed. Hours passed slowly. The apprentice focused on smoothing sections of wall under the guidance of an experienced craftsman. The older man rarely spoke unnecessarily. Yet when he offered advice, every word carried value. Slow hands make fewer mistakes, he said. The apprentice remembered that. Inside the tomb, rushing rarely helped. The best craftsmen moved carefully. Deliberately. With purpose. By late afternoon, the chamber looked noticeably different. The floor was cleaner. The walls were more prepared. The room felt closer to becoming part of the sacred tomb. Small improvements accumulated day after day. Often so gradually that workers barely noticed them. Yet when viewed over months or years, the transformation became remarkable. Outside the valley, life continued as always. The Nile flowed steadily through Egypt. Farmers tended fields. Boats traveled along the river. Markets opened and closed. Children grew older. The kingdom moved forward. Most people never saw the hidden valleys where royal tombs were built. Most never met the workers who dedicated their lives to such projects. Yet the labor performed here formed part of a much larger world. The apprentice sometimes forgot that. The valley felt isolated. Almost separate from the rest of Egypt. But supplies arrived from elsewhere. Officials traveled through. Messages came and went. The workers remained connected to the kingdom even when they felt far away from it. As evening approached, a messenger arrived at the village. News spread quietly. Not dramatic news. Not shocking news. Simply information from officials connected to the royal administration. Yet messages from beyond the valley always attracted attention. People wondered what changes might be coming. Whether new projects would begin. Whether current plans would continue unchanged. The apprentice overheard fragments of conversation but learned few details. Most information passed first through supervisors and administrators. Ordinary workers often heard the full story later. That evening, after returning home, he sat outside with his family. The desert sky glowed softly as daylight faded. His father repaired a wooden tool handle. His mother prepared food. Neighbors talked nearby. Everything felt peaceful, comfortably familiar. The apprentice listened to the sounds around him. Children laughing. A distant conversation. The occasional bark of a dog. Simple sounds. Yet they created a feeling of home. One day, he realized, future generations might remember the tombs. They might remember the kings buried within them. But they would know little about evenings like this. Little about families sharing meals. Little about craftsmen repairing tools. Little about ordinary people living ordinary lives. And yet those quiet moments formed the true heart of the village. As darkness deepened, stars appeared overhead. The apprentice lay upon his sleeping mat later that night, thinking about the future. He wondered what kind of craftsman he might become. Would he master painting? Would he become a stonecutter? Would he one day teach apprentices of his own? The future remained uncertain. But the path ahead seemed steady, predictable, comforting. At least for now. Because beyond the peaceful routines of the village, changes were beginning to gather strength. Slowly, almost invisibly, officials were becoming concerned about supplies in certain regions. Transportation delays were becoming more common. Administrative problems were beginning to appear. Nothing serious yet. Nothing that had directly affected the workers. But the first small signs were there. Like distant clouds on a clear horizon. Easy to ignore. Easy to overlook. Yet destined to move closer with time. For now, however, the village slept peacefully beneath the stars. The workers rested. The tomb waited. And another day in the ancient desert quietly came to an end. The challenges ahead had not yet arrived. But they were slowly making their way toward the valley, one step at a time. The days that followed seemed calm on the surface. The workers continued waking before dawn. They continued walking through the desert. They continued shaping stone beneath the silent cliffs. And yet, little by little, subtle changes were beginning to appear around them. Not dramatic changes. Not the kind that immediately capture attention. These were the quiet kinds of changes. The sort that arrive slowly enough to blend into everyday life. At first, most workers barely noticed them. The young apprentice certainly did not. His thoughts remained focused on learning. Every day brought another lesson. Every day offered another opportunity to improve his skills. The royal tomb itself had become his world. Its corridors felt familiar. Its chambers felt almost alive. The smell of stone dust greeted him each morning. The flickering light of oil lamps accompanied his work throughout the day. The distant sounds of chisels echoed through the passages like a steady heartbeat. For the apprentice, these things seemed permanent, unchanging. But older workers knew better. Nothing remained unchanged forever. One morning, as workers gathered before entering the tomb, the apprentice noticed several master craftsmen speaking quietly together. Their expressions appeared thoughtful. Not frightened. Not worried. Simply thoughtful. When the apprentice asked one of the older men if something was wrong, the craftsman smiled softly. "Nothing wrong," he said. "Just news." The apprentice nodded. News often traveled slowly through Egypt. A message might take days or even weeks to reach distant places. By the time ordinary workers heard information, many officials already knew it. Still, News carried importance, especially when it involved supplies, construction projects, or the royal administration. The apprentice returned to his work. Yet the conversation lingered in his mind. As the day progressed, he found himself noticing something else. The tomb had become almost like a village beneath the stone. Each worker knew where to go. Each person understood their responsibilities. The painters occupied certain areas. The stonecutters worked elsewhere. The plasterers moved between sections preparing surfaces. The scribes appeared regularly, recording progress. The system functioned smoothly because everyone understood their role. Years of experience had created a rhythm that rarely changed. The apprentice admired that rhythm. It felt reassuring, predictable, orderly. Ancient Egypt valued order deeply. The workers reflected that value in their daily lives. Even small tasks followed established patterns. Tools were stored carefully. Materials were accounted for. Work areas were organized. Nothing was left entirely to chance. As midday approached, the apprentice assisted one of the artists who was decorating a newly prepared wall. The process fascinated him. The artist began with guidelines. Then came sketches. Gradually, the figures emerged. Gods. Symbols. Sacred scenes. The wall transformed step by step. The apprentice watched closely. Every movement seemed deliberate. Every line carried purpose. The artist noticed his attention and smiled. "Most people see the finished painting," he said quietly. "They do not see the hundreds of small steps that create it." The apprentice understood immediately. The same idea applied to the entire tomb. Visitors might someday admire completed chambers. They might marvel at beautiful decorations. But they would never witness the years of labor hidden behind those finished surfaces. They would never see the stonecutters sweating in narrow passages. They would never see workers carrying debris through dusty corridors. They would never see apprentices learning their trade one mistake at a time. The tomb concealed countless stories. Stories belonging not to kings, but to workers. That afternoon, after work ended, the apprentice lingered briefly near the valley entrance. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. Golden light spilled across the cliffs. The desert appeared almost peaceful enough to sleep. No crowds. No noise. Only wind moving gently through the rocks. Nearby, an older stonecutter paused beside him. The man had spent decades working in the valley. His face carried the marks of age. His hands carried the marks of labor. Together they watched the sunlight slowly shift across the landscape. Finally, the stonecutter spoke. "When I was young," he said, "I thought the tombs were the most important thing here." The apprentice listened. "But now," the older man continued, "I think the people are." The apprentice glanced toward him. The craftsman smiled softly. "The tombs are beautiful. They last a long time. But without people, they are only empty rooms." The words stayed with the apprentice. As they began the walk back to the village, he found himself thinking about the workers differently. The village contained painters, stonecutters, plasterers, scribes, toolmakers, cooks, children, parents, grandparents. Together they formed a community. A living community. The tomb existed because of them. Not the other way around. That evening, life in the village unfolded much as it always did. Children played outside. Families prepared meals. Neighbors exchanged news. A few workers sat together discussing the day's progress. Others focused on household repairs. Simple tasks filled the hours before darkness arrived. The apprentice's father spent part of the evening repairing a worn basket. The reeds had begun to loosen. Nothing unusual. Just another small maintenance task among many. Ancient life required constant upkeep. Tools broke. Roofs cracked. Containers wore out. Repairs never truly ended. The apprentice helped where he could. In return, his father shared stories from earlier years. Stories about workers who had come before. Stories about difficult projects. Stories about times when supplies became scarce. The apprentice listened carefully. One story in particular caught his attention. Years earlier, according to his father, deliveries to the village had been delayed for an extended period. The workers became frustrated. Not because they wanted luxury. Because they depended on those supplies. Bread depended on grain. Families depended on bread. When shipments failed to arrive, daily life became more difficult. Eventually the problem had been solved. The village recovered. Life returned to normal. Yet the memory remained. The apprentice began noticing a pattern. Whenever older workers spoke about the past, supplies often appeared in their stories. Not battles. Not royal ceremonies. Not famous victories. Food. Tools. Deliveries. The practical realities of everyday life. Those things mattered most to ordinary people. Later that night, after darkness covered the village, the apprentice stepped outside for a few moments. The stars stretched across the sky. Bright and countless. The desert air felt cool. Peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear a dog barking. Then silence returned. He looked toward the dark outline of the cliffs. The royal tomb lay hidden there, invisible beneath the night sky. Waiting for another day of work. Waiting for another layer of paint. Another section of carved stone. Another step toward completion. The apprentice felt proud to be part of something so important. Yet he also understood something he had not understood before. The tomb was not merely a monument. It was the result of thousands of ordinary days. Thousands of meals. Thousands of walks through the desert. Thousands of conversations between workers. Thousands of careful decisions. History often focused on great events. But great things were usually built from small moments. One after another. Day after day. Year after year. The next morning arrived much like every other. The workers gathered. The journey began. The valley welcomed them once more. But shortly after sunrise, a supervisor received a message from visiting officials. The conversation remained private. Most workers heard nothing. They continued their tasks as usual. Yet whispers began spreading quietly. A shipment expected from another region had been delayed again. Not cancelled. Not lost. Simply delayed. For now, the problem seemed minor. The workers continued their labor. The tomb continued growing. Life continued moving forward. But among the older craftsmen, a familiar concern was beginning to return. They had seen delays before. They understood how small problems sometimes became larger ones. And while the apprentice remained focused on learning his craft, the first shadows of uncertainty were slowly approaching the village. Not enough to disturb its peace. Not yet. But enough that a few experienced workers were beginning to watch the horizon a little more carefully than before. And deep within the royal tomb, beneath layers of stone and silence, the story of the workers continued to unfold, one quiet day at a time. the delayed shipment did not immediately change life in the workers' village. A few conversations mentioned it. A few supervisors discussed it quietly among themselves. But for most people, daily routines continued much as they always had. The sun still rose over the desert. The workers still gathered before dawn. The path to the valley still wound between silent cliffs and weathered stone. And deep inside the royal tomb, the sound of tools still echoed through the darkness. For the young apprentice, another week brought another set of lessons. The master craftsman expected more from him now. Not because he had become an expert. Far from it. But because he had proven that he could learn. That he could pay attention. That he could work carefully. In a place where mistakes sometimes remained visible for centuries, careful workers were highly valued. One morning, shortly after entering the tomb, the apprentice was asked to help prepare pigments for a group of artists. It was delicate work. The colors used inside royal tombs did not simply appear ready for use. They required time and effort. Minerals were ground into fine powder. The powder was mixed carefully. Measurements mattered. Consistency mattered. Even small differences could affect the final appearance of a painting. The apprentice worked slowly. Patiently. Nearby, one of the painters examined a section of completed artwork. The figure on the wall seemed almost alive in the flickering lamplight. Its lines were elegant. Its colors rich and steady. The apprentice often wondered how many years it took to develop such skill. The painter noticed him looking. "Every line comes from practice," he said. "Thousands of lines." The apprentice nodded. The answer seemed simple. Yet it carried truth. Great craftsmanship rarely arrived suddenly. It grew little by little. One day at a time. One lesson at a time. Much like the tomb itself. As the morning progressed, workers moved through the corridors carrying materials. Some transported stone. Others carried plaster. Others delivered tools. The entire project depended upon coordination. No single task existed alone. Everything connected. If the stonecutters fell behind, artists waited. If plasterers fell behind, painters waited. If supplies failed to arrive, everyone felt the consequences. The village functioned because people depended upon one another. This interdependence extended beyond the tomb. Families relied upon workers. Workers relied upon administrators. Administrators relied upon deliveries from distant regions. The entire system stretched across the kingdom. Invisible threads connecting one place to another. The apprentice was beginning to understand that. Life in the valley felt isolated. But it was not truly separate from Egypt. It was part of something larger. Something that reached far beyond the desert hills. Later that day, during a break, several workers sat together discussing old projects. The apprentice listened quietly. One craftsman described a tomb completed many years earlier. Another remembered a difficult corridor where the stone repeatedly cracked in unexpected ways. A third recalled a supervisor known for demanding perfection in every detail. The stories flowed naturally. Some were humorous. Some thoughtful. Some slightly exaggerated, as stories often become over time. Yet all of them revealed something important. The workers carried their own history. A history rarely written in royal inscriptions. A history passed through memory and conversation. The apprentice realized that each older worker represented a living record. They remembered events no scribe had recorded. They remembered personalities. Arguments. Friendships. Mistakes. Victories. The human side of history. As the break ended, everyone returned to work. The lamps continued burning. The tools continued moving. The tomb continued growing. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher. Heat settled over the valley. The pale cliffs reflected light so brightly that looking directly at them became uncomfortable. Yet inside the tomb, the world remained dim and cool by comparison. The apprentice had become accustomed to that contrast. The brightness outside. The shadows within. Two different worlds connected by narrow entrances carved into stone. By late afternoon, the apprentice found himself helping an experienced craftsman inspect a completed wall section. The work appeared flawless to him. Smooth plaster. Clean lines. Balanced proportions. Yet the master still found small details requiring attention. A slight unevenness. A tiny imperfection. Something most people would never notice. The apprentice asked why such minor flaws mattered. The older craftsman smiled. Because we notice them. That was all he said. But the apprentice understood. The workers built these tombs not only for kings. They built them according to standards they set for themselves. Pride existed in good work. Even when no one else saw it. Even when recognition never came. As evening approached, the workers prepared to leave. The familiar walk back to the village began. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. The air gradually cooled. The harsh brightness of midday softened into warm golden light. The apprentice enjoyed this time of day. The work was finished. The heat was fading. And the landscape seemed peaceful beyond words. When he reached the village, he discovered that several families had gathered near an open space between houses. Nothing unusual had happened. No special event. People simply enjoyed spending time together. Children ran through the narrow pathways. Older villagers exchanged stories. Someone shared fresh bread. Someone else brought dates. Simple acts of community. The apprentice sat beside his father. Together they watched the evening unfold. A group of older workers discussed recent rumors regarding supply deliveries. The apprentice listened carefully. The conversation remained calm. No one seemed alarmed. Yet there was a slight seriousness beneath the words. Several shipments had arrived later than expected. Officials apparently blamed transportation difficulties. Others mentioned administrative issues. No one knew the full story. And perhaps no one needed to know. For now, life continued normally. Still, the topic appeared more often than before. The apprentice noticed that people rarely worried about a single delayed shipment. They worried when delays became a pattern. As darkness settled over the village, families gradually returned indoors. The stars appeared overhead. The desert grew quiet once again. The apprentice lay awake for a short time before sleep arrived. His thoughts wandered through the events of the day. The paintings. The conversations. The stories shared by older craftsmen. He thought about how much knowledge existed within the village. Knowledge gathered over generations. Techniques passed from master to apprentice. Lessons carried through decades. The workers built more than tombs. They preserved skills. Traditions. Ways of understanding the world. And those things seemed just as valuable. Eventually sleep claimed him. The night passed. Morning returned. Another workday began. Yet on this particular morning, something felt slightly different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just different. Several officials had arrived from outside the village. Their presence attracted attention immediately. Visitors were not uncommon. But these men carried an air of purpose. They met with supervisors. They reviewed records. They inspected storage areas. Throughout the morning, workers glanced toward them occasionally. Curiosity spread quietly. No one stopped working. No one caused disruption. Still, questions lingered. Why had they come? What were they examining? What concerns did they have? Answers did not arrive immediately. The officials remained busy. The workers remained busy. And the tomb continued moving toward completion. But by the end of the day, one thing had become clear. The supply issues were receiving attention from higher authorities. Something had prompted these inspections. Something had prompted these discussions. Whether the situation would improve or worsen remained unknown. The apprentice understood very little about administration. Very little about politics. Very little about the complicated systems that supported the village. But he could sense that the older workers were paying closer attention now. Watching. Listening. Waiting. And as another sunset painted the desert cliffs in gold and amber light, the workers walked home once more, carrying with them a quiet feeling that changes might be approaching. Not today. Perhaps not tomorrow. But soon. And like the slow movement of sand across the desert floor, those changes were already beginning to shape the future of the royal tomb builders. The officials remained in the village for several more days. Their presence became part of the landscape, much like the mud brick houses or the narrow pathways that wound between them. At first, everyone paid close attention whenever they appeared. Workers exchanged quiet glances. Families whispered during evening meals. Children watched from a distance. But as the days passed, curiosity slowly settled into routine. The officials inspected records. They met with supervisors. They counted supplies. And life continued. For the young apprentice, the work inside the tomb remained the center of each day. The royal tomb had grown steadily over the years. Corridors stretched deeper into the hillside. Walls once rough and unfinished now displayed carefully painted scenes. Rooms that had once echoed with the noise of excavation now carried a sense of quiet purpose. The apprentice sometimes paused for a moment to look around. Not for long. There was always work to do. But occasionally he allowed himself a brief glance at what the workers had accomplished. It was remarkable. Not because of grandeur alone, but because every section represented thousands of hours of labor. Every painted figure, every carved inscription, every smooth wall. Someone had spent part of their life creating it. One morning, while assisting with preparation work in a newly finished chamber, the apprentice found himself working alongside a craftsman named Hori. Hori was neither the oldest worker nor the most famous. Yet nearly everyone respected him. He rarely spoke loudly. He rarely complained. And he seemed to understand almost every aspect of tomb construction. If a tool broke, Hori often knew how to repair it. If a wall presented problems, Hori usually had a solution. If disagreements arose between workers, Hori often helped settle them peacefully. As they worked together, the apprentice noticed Hori studying a painted wall. Not critically. Almost thoughtfully. "What are you looking at?" the apprentice asked. Hori smiled. "The people." The apprentice glanced at the wall. It showed sacred figures and ceremonial scenes. "I don't understand," he admitted. Hori gently touched the air near the painting, without touching the wall itself. "Most people see kings," he said. I see workers. The apprentice remained silent. The artists who painted it? The craftsmen who prepared the wall? The people who made the pigments? The workers who cut the stone? They are all here, even if nobody painted their faces. The apprentice thought about those words long after the conversation ended. Because once he heard them, he began seeing the tomb differently. Every completed chamber became a collection of invisible lives. The finished work remained visible. The people behind it often disappeared. Yet their presence lingered everywhere. As the day continued, workers moved through the tomb carrying baskets of materials. The lamps flickered. Dust drifted softly through the air. The sounds of labor echoed from distant corridors. Nothing dramatic occurred. Nothing unusual happened. Yet there was something comforting about that. Life did not need great events every day. Most days were built from ordinary moments. And ordinary moments carried their own quiet beauty. Back in the village, families followed familiar routines. Mothers prepared meals. Children learned household tasks. Neighbors shared news. Repairs continued on homes that constantly battled the effects of time and weather. Life required effort. Yet it also provided moments of peace. That evening, after work ended, the apprentice's family gathered outside their home. The heat of the day had finally begun to fade. A gentle breeze moved through the village. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. Nearby, an elderly woman told stories to a group of children. Her voice rose and fell softly. The children listened with wide eyes. The apprentice smiled as he watched them. The stories were old. Some probably older than anyone present. Passed from one generation to the next. Carried through memory rather than stone. The village preserved more than craftsmanship. It preserved stories, songs, traditions, ways of living. As darkness settled over the desert, the stars appeared one by one. The apprentice had always loved this part of the evening. The quietness, the cool air, the endless sky. Ancient Egyptians spent much of their lives beneath those stars. The heavens felt close in the desert. Almost close enough to touch. Many workers knew the constellations well. They could identify familiar patterns without difficulty. The stars guided travelers, marked seasons, inspired religious beliefs, and offered companionship during long nights. The apprentice often wondered how many generations before him had looked upward and seen the same sky. How many workers had stood in this very village? How many craftsmen had walked the same paths? History suddenly felt much larger than any single person. The next morning, work resumed as usual. But shortly after arriving at the tomb, an unusual request reached several supervisors. A group of officials wanted updated reports regarding progress inside the royal tomb. Such requests were not unheard of. Royal projects received attention from administrators. Yet the timing seemed notable. The inspections, the record reviews, the questions about supplies. Everything appeared connected somehow. Workers discussed it quietly during breaks. Nobody knew the complete story. Still, a feeling lingered. Something was happening beyond the valley. Something important enough to attract official attention. For now, however, the impact remained distant. The apprentice spent most of the day helping transport materials between chambers. It was tiring work. The corridors seemed longer when carrying heavy loads. The air felt warmer. The lamps seemed dimmer. Yet he enjoyed contributing. Every task mattered. Every effort supported the larger project. As the afternoon progressed, he passed through one of the older completed sections of the tomb. The paintings there had been finished years earlier. Their colors remained vibrant. Their lines remained sharp. The chamber felt almost timeless. For a moment, the apprentice stopped. Only briefly. He studied the artwork. The figures seemed calm, peaceful, eternal. The craftsmen who painted them might already be old men. Some might even be gone. Yet their work endured. That realization brought both comfort and sadness. Life was temporary. The work remained. Perhaps that was one reason the workers took such pride in what they created. Their efforts became part of something larger than themselves. Part of a story that would continue long after they were gone. Later, during the walk home, several older workers discussed memories from earlier years. One story led to another. Soon they were recalling periods when work had slowed due to shortages. Periods when deliveries had failed to arrive on time. Periods when officials struggled to solve logistical problems. The apprentice listened carefully. A pattern emerged. The village had faced challenges before. Life had not always been smooth. Yet the community endured. Workers adapted. Families supported one another. Solutions eventually emerged. The stories carried a quiet sense of resilience. The older craftsmen were not frightened by difficulties. They had survived them before. That evening, the apprentice shared some of these thoughts with his father. His father listened quietly, then nodded. Every generation faces problems, he said. The important thing is how people face them together. The apprentice liked that answer. It felt true. The village existed because people depended on one another. No worker built a tomb alone. No family survived alone. Community made difficult things possible. As the night deepened, the village gradually became silent. Lamps dimmed. Conversations faded. The stars shone overhead. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the Nile continued its endless journey through Egypt. Farmers tended fields. Boats traveled the river. Officials managed distant affairs. The kingdom moved forward. And hidden among the desert hills, the workers slept peacefully. Unaware that within the coming months, the supply concerns would grow more serious. Unaware that their community would soon experience one of the most remarkable moments in labor history. A moment that future generations would remember. A moment that would reveal just how important these workers truly were. But that chapter had not yet arrived. For now, the village rested beneath the stars. And another quiet day in the life of the royal tomb builders came gently to an end. The weeks passed quietly. One after another. The rhythm of life remained familiar enough that many workers stopped thinking about it. Morning followed morning. The village awakened before sunrise. Families prepared simple meals. Workers gathered their tools. And long lines of craftsmen made their way through the desert toward the hidden valley. The young apprentice had now spent enough time among the workers that he no longer felt like an outsider. The older craftsmen greeted him by name. Supervisors trusted him with more responsibilities. Even the master artists occasionally allowed him to observe their work more closely. Little by little, he was becoming part of the community. Not just a boy learning a trade. A worker. A tomb builder. Someone whose efforts contributed to the great project hidden beneath the cliffs. One morning, as the first light touched the valley walls, the apprentice arrived earlier than usual. The air still carried the coolness of night. The desert seemed almost asleep. Only a handful of workers had reached the tomb entrance. For a few moments, he stood quietly and looked across the landscape. The cliffs rose around him like enormous guardians. Their pale stone reflected the growing sunlight. No trees interrupted the view. No rivers crossed the valley floor. Only rock, sand, sky, and silence. It was difficult to imagine a more isolated place. Yet despite its loneliness, the valley contained life. Every day, hundreds of people moved through it. They worked. They talked. They laughed. They worried. They dreamed. The valley was not empty at all. It was full of human stories. As work began, the apprentice joined a team preparing another chamber for decoration. The room had already been carved from the rock. Its basic shape was complete. Now came the careful process of refinement. Walls needed smoothing. Imperfections needed correction. Every surface had to be prepared before artists could begin their work. The apprentice enjoyed this stage. There was satisfaction in transforming rough stone into something orderly. Something ready for beauty. Nearby, an older plasterer worked with remarkable patience. His movements seemed almost effortless. Years of experience guided his hands. The apprentice watched him for a while. The man noticed. "You are studying again," the plasterer said with a smile. The apprentice laughed softly. "Trying to learn?" The craftsman nodded. "Good. Stone teaches slowly." That answer seemed strangely fitting. Everything in the valley happened slowly. The tomb itself emerged slowly. Skills developed slowly. Even trust grew slowly. Nothing important happened overnight. As the hours passed, workers settled into their routines. The familiar sounds filled the corridors. Chisels striking stone. Footsteps on rock floors. Voices carrying through narrow passages. The crackling flames of oil lamps. Together, these sounds formed the music of the tomb. The apprentice had grown so accustomed to them that silence would have felt unusual. Around midday, a small group of scribes arrived to record progress. This was not unusual. Scribes visited frequently. Yet today they seemed especially thorough. They asked questions. Checked inventories. Reviewed records. One of the supervisors spent considerable time speaking with them. Workers noticed. Workers always noticed. But few asked questions directly. Ancient Egypt was a society built upon order and hierarchy. People understood their roles. Information often traveled downward gradually. The apprentice learned long ago that answers usually arrived eventually. There was no need to chase them. Later that afternoon, during a meal break, several craftsmen sat together discussing life in the village. The conversation wandered naturally from topic to topic. Repairs needed at home. Children growing older. Upcoming religious celebrations. Then, inevitably, the subject returned to supplies. A shipment had finally arrived. But it had arrived later than expected. Again. The workers exchanged thoughtful glances. No panic. No anger. Just concern. Many of them remembered previous shortages. They knew how quickly small delays could become larger problems. One elderly worker took a bite of bread before speaking. "I've seen this before," he said. The others listened. "It starts with delays. Then explanations. Then more delays." Nobody responded immediately. Not because they disagreed. Because they were thinking. The apprentice listened carefully. He was young. Young enough that many of these concerns still felt distant. The older workers viewed things differently. They had lived through difficult years. They had learned to recognize warning signs. Still, work continued. The tomb demanded attention. The king's resting place could not wait for perfect circumstances. Every day brought another task. Another wall. Another corridor. Another section of artwork. As evening approached, the apprentice found himself helping clean a completed chamber. The room looked beautiful. Painted figures covered the walls. Colors glowed softly beneath the lamplight. The chamber felt peaceful. Almost sacred. For a moment, he imagined how future generations might view it. Would they understand how much effort had gone into its creation? Would they think about the workers? The painters? The stonecutters? Or would they see only the king? The thought lingered as he finished his work. Outside, the sun was already descending toward the horizon. The workers began their journey home. The familiar procession moved through the valley. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. The air cooled gradually. The cliffs glowed golden beneath the evening light. Many workers enjoyed this walk. It marked the transition between labor and home. Between responsibility and rest. The apprentice walked beside Hori, the experienced craftsman he admired. For a time, neither spoke. They simply enjoyed the quiet. Eventually, Hori broke the silence. Do you know why this village is special? The apprentice considered the question. Because we build royal tombs. Hori smiled. Partly. The apprentice waited. But mostly because people here understand each other. The older man looked toward the village in the distance. We share the same work. The same struggles. The same hopes. The apprentice nodded. The answer felt simple. Yet meaningful. The village was small. Isolated. Remote. But those qualities had created a strong community. People depended upon one another. They knew one another. That bond gave the settlement a unique character. When they reached the village, signs of evening life appeared everywhere. Families prepared meals. Children chased one another through dusty pathways. Neighbors gathered outside their homes. The scent of baking bread drifted through the air. The apprentice always found comfort in these scenes. No matter how demanding the workday had been, home brought peace. That night, after dinner, his father invited him to sit outside. The stars had begun appearing overhead. The village had grown quieter. For a while they simply watched the sky. Then his father began speaking about his own apprenticeship years earlier. The stories felt distant. Almost belonging to another world. Yet many details sounded familiar. The long work days. The patient teachers. The friendships formed inside the tomb. Some things never changed. Finally, his father mentioned something that caught the apprentice's attention. There was a time, he said, when the workers refused to continue. The apprentice looked surprised. Refused. Such behavior seemed difficult to imagine. The workers were dedicated. Responsible. Proud of their craft. His father nodded. They had reasons. The apprentice wanted to hear more. But the older man simply smiled. That is a story for another evening. The conversation moved elsewhere. Yet curiosity remained. The apprentice lay awake later that night thinking about those words. Workers refusing to continue. What circumstances could lead to that? What could be serious enough to make skilled craftsmen stop working on a royal tomb? The question stayed with him. Outside, the desert remained silent beneath the stars. The cliff stood motionless. The royal tomb waited patiently for another day of labor. And somewhere beyond the village, beyond the valley, beyond the desert itself, events continued unfolding. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Like distant storm clouds gathering far beyond the horizon. The workers could not yet see the full shape of what was coming. But the first signs were already there. The delayed shipments. The inspections. The growing concern among older craftsmen. Each seemed small by itself. Together, they formed the beginning of a larger story. A story that would soon test the village in ways few could yet imagine. And as the apprentice drifted into sleep beneath the vast Egyptian sky, the future moved quietly closer, one day at a time. The next morning arrived with the same gentle certainty as countless mornings before it. A faint band of silver appeared along the horizon. The stars slowly retreated. The desert air remained cool for a little while longer. And throughout the workers' village, small signs of life began to appear. Doors opened. Footsteps sounded on dusty paths. Clay lamps flickered and went dark. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the still morning air. The young apprentice woke before sunrise, as he always did. For a few moments, he lay quietly and listened. The village possessed a unique sound at this hour. Not silence. Not quite. More like a collection of soft noises. A distant voice. The scrape of a stool against a floor. The rustle of clothing. Someone drawing water. Small sounds. Gentle sounds. The sounds of ordinary life beginning once again. Soon he joined the growing line of workers heading toward the valley. The path had become so familiar that many could have walked it in darkness. The cliff stood ahead, pale and motionless beneath the early light. As always, the apprentice felt a strange mixture of comfort and wonder when he approached them. The valley was a workplace. But it was also something more. A world hidden from most of Egypt. A place where generations of craftsmen spent their lives shaping eternity from stone. The day's work began much as usual. Teams moved to their assigned areas. Tools were distributed. Lamps were lit. The steady rhythm of labor returned. Yet the apprentice found himself thinking about the conversation he had shared with his father the previous evening. The workers refusing to continue. The idea seemed impossible. And yet his father had spoken about it as if it had truly happened. The apprentice wanted to know more. But for now, work demanded his attention. Inside one chamber, artists continued decorating scenes that would accompany the king into the next life. Their brushes moved carefully. Patiently. Every figure followed established traditions. Every symbol carried meaning. The apprentice watched for a moment before returning to his own task. He was helping prepare materials for another section of work. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would attract attention. Yet such tasks mattered. The tomb depended upon countless small efforts. Many of the most important jobs went unnoticed. That was simply the nature of craftsmanship. As the morning progressed, conversations drifted through the corridors. Workers often talked while performing familiar tasks. Not constantly. Not loudly. Just enough to make the long hours pass more comfortably. One group discussed repairs needed in the village. Another talked about an upcoming festival. Elsewhere, several older craftsmen quietly exchanged thoughts about supply deliveries. The subject appeared more frequently now. Not because anyone enjoyed worrying. Because the delays continued. Several expected shipments had arrived late. Others had arrived incomplete. Nothing disastrous had happened. Not yet. but uncertainty had begun creeping into conversations. The apprentice noticed it. Everyone noticed it. Even when nobody spoke directly about it. By midday, the heat outside had become intense. The pale cliffs reflected sunlight across the valley. Most workers welcomed the relative coolness of the tomb's interior. During the meal break, the apprentice sat with several experienced craftsmen. Among them was Hori. As usual, the older man seemed calm, thoughtful, unhurried. One worker mentioned the recent delays. Another shrugged. A third frowned slightly. Then Hori spoke. People can endure many things. The others listened. Hard work. Long days. Difficult conditions. He paused. But families must eat. Nobody disagreed. Nobody needed to. The statement carried its own truth. The workers accepted labor. They accepted responsibility. But they also depended upon the supplies promised to them. Bread mattered. Grain mattered. The practical realities of life mattered. For all the beauty of royal tombs and sacred artwork, ordinary people still needed food on their tables. The apprentice thought about this long after the conversation ended. He had always viewed the tomb as the center of life. But perhaps life extended beyond the valley in ways he had not fully understood. The tomb mattered. Yet families mattered too. Communities mattered. The workers did not labor for stone alone. They labored for the people waiting at home each evening. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. The apprentice helped transport materials between chambers. The corridors seemed endless at times. Their walls glowed softly in the lamplight. The air carried the familiar scent of stone dust. Everything felt steady, predictable, almost timeless. Yet beneath that calm surface, change continued gathering strength. Not visible, not dramatic, but present. Like water slowly rising behind a distant dam. As sunset approached, the workers began their journey back to the village. The cliffs glowed gold beneath the fading light. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. The air cooled gradually. For a while, the apprentice walked alone. He enjoyed these moments. The quietness. The openness of the landscape. The feeling that the entire desert was slowly preparing for sleep. When he reached the village, he found a small group gathered near one of the storage buildings. Nothing unusual. People often gathered there. But tonight the conversation seemed serious. Several administrators were reviewing inventories, checking supplies, making notes. The apprentice did not stop. Yet he noticed the expressions on their faces. Focused, concerned, careful. Whatever challenges existed, they were clearly receiving attention. That evening, after dinner, the apprentice sat with his father once again. The stars emerged overhead. A cool breeze moved through the village. The perfect setting for stories. Eventually the apprentice asked the question that had occupied his thoughts all day. The workers who refused to continue, he said quietly. His father nodded. He had expected the question. For several moments, he remained silent. Then he began. It happened many years ago. The apprentice listened carefully. The workers were not angry at first. His father stared toward the dark outline of the cliffs. They were patient. The apprentice could imagine that. Patience seemed woven into the character of the village itself. But supplies became delayed. His father's voice remained calm. Then delayed again. The apprentice felt himself leaning forward slightly. Families began struggling. The older man paused. The workers continued waiting. The story felt different from the legends children heard. There were no heroes fighting monsters. No dramatic battles. Only ordinary people facing ordinary problems. Yet somehow that made it more powerful. What happened then? The apprentice asked. His father smiled softly. That story is long. The apprentice almost laughed. Most worthwhile stories were. His father looked up at the stars. And it begins with a village very much like ours. For a while, they sat quietly beneath the night sky. The conversation would continue another evening. There was no hurry. The story had waited years already. It could wait one more day. Across the village, families settled into their homes. Lamps glowed faintly through doorways. Children drifted to sleep. Workers rested tired muscles. The desert returned to silence. And hidden beyond the cliffs, the royal tomb waited patiently. Its walls carried the marks of countless craftsmen. Its chambers held years of labor. Its future remained uncertain. Because the story the apprentice was beginning to hear was not merely a story from the past. It was a warning. A memory. A reminder of what could happen when those who built the tombs were pushed too far. The older workers remembered. The administrators remembered. Perhaps even the officials remembered. And though the apprentice did not yet realize it, he was slowly approaching one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the royal tomb builders. A chapter born not from war. Not from kings. Not from treasure. But from ordinary workers who simply wanted what had been promised. Another peaceful night settled over the desert. That chapter moved a little closer. The days continued to move forward with the slow certainty of the Nile itself. Nothing seemed rushed in the workers' village. Nothing happened all at once. The sun rose. The workers labored. The sun set. Families gathered. And life continued along the same well-worn paths that generations before them had followed. Yet for the young apprentice, something had changed. Not in the village. Not in the tomb. Inside his own mind. His father's unfinished story lingered there. The story of workers who had once refused to continue. The story of delayed supplies and growing hardship. The story that older craftsmen seemed to remember with unusual seriousness. It remained unfinished. And because it remained unfinished, the apprentice found himself thinking about it often. As he walked toward the valley each morning, he wondered what had truly happened. As he worked inside the tomb, he noticed conversations differently. He paid more attention when older workers discussed supplies. He listened more carefully when administrators exchanged quiet words. The village had always seemed stable. Now he was beginning to understand how much effort was required to keep it that way. One morning, shortly after entering the tomb, he found Hori examining a newly prepared wall. The experienced craftsman ran his fingers lightly across the plaster, checking for imperfections. The apprentice joined him. For a while they worked in silence. Then Hori spoke. "Do you know what makes a wall strong?" The apprentice thought for a moment. "Good materials." Hori nodded. "That helps." The older man continued inspecting the surface. "What else?" The apprentice considered again. "Careful work." "Yes." Hori smiled. Then he tapped gently against the wall. "But there is something more." The apprentice waited. "A wall is strongest when every layer beneath it is strong." The answer seemed simple. Yet as often happened with Hori's words, it carried a deeper meaning. The tomb depended upon many layers. stonecutters, plasterers, painters, scribes, administrators, families, suppliers. Every layer supported another. If one weakened, others eventually felt the strain. The apprentice thought about that throughout the day. As he moved through the corridors, he noticed how interconnected everything truly was. Workers relied upon tools. Tools relied upon materials. Materials relied upon deliveries. Deliveries relied upon officials. Officials relied upon systems operating far beyond the valley. Nothing existed alone. Everything connected. That afternoon, a shipment finally arrived at the village. The news spread quickly. Not because the delivery was unusual. Because people had been waiting. Workers watched as supplies were unloaded. Administrators checked records. Scribes made notes. For a while, the atmosphere seemed lighter. More relaxed. The arrival reassured people. At least temporarily. Yet several older craftsmen exchanged thoughtful glances. The apprentice noticed. The shipment had arrived. But it had arrived late again. The pattern remained. And patterns mattered. Especially to people who had seen similar situations before. As evening approached, the workers returned home. The village glowed softly beneath the fading sunlight. Children played between houses. Neighbors exchanged greetings. The scent of food drifted through the air. Life appeared peaceful. Comfortable. Almost untouched by concern. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, people were paying attention. Watching. Waiting. Measuring whether the delays would continue. After dinner, the apprentice joined his father outside. The stars emerged overhead. A cool desert breeze moved gently through the village. The perfect evening for stories. For a time they sat quietly. Then his father resumed the tale. The workers waited, he said. The apprentice immediately knew which story he meant. They trusted that the supplies would arrive. The older man stared toward the dark desert. Days passed. The apprentice listened carefully. Then more days. His father's voice remained calm. Slow. Almost like the rhythm of the story itself. The workers continued their labor. They continued building tombs. They continued fulfilling their responsibilities. The apprentice nodded. That sounded exactly like the workers he knew. Dedicated. Patient. Reliable. But eventually, his father continued, the food still had not arrived. The night seemed quieter now. Even the wind had grown still. Families became worried. The apprentice could imagine it. Bread supplies shrinking. Storage jars becoming emptier. Parents wondering how much longer they could wait. The concerns felt deeply human. Not political. Not grand. Simply human. The workers spoke among themselves, his father said. They did not want trouble. The apprentice believed that. Nothing about the village suggested rebellion or conflict. These were craftsmen. Builders. Artists. They wanted solutions. His father paused. And when solutions failed to appear, something remarkable happened. The apprentice waited. They acted together. The older man fell silent. The story stopped there. Again. The apprentice laughed softly. You always stop at the important part. His father smiled. A good story needs time. The apprentice shook his head. Yet secretly he enjoyed it. The story unfolded the same way life unfolded. Gradually. Patiently. one piece at a time. Later that night, as he prepared for sleep, the apprentice thought about those workers from years earlier. He imagined them sitting beneath the same stars, walking the same paths, facing the same cliffs. Their lives could not have been very different from his own. The realization made history feel closer, more personal. The workers of the past were not distant figures. They were people. People with worries. People with families. People who hoped for stability and fairness. Much like the workers of today. The following morning brought another journey into the valley. The tomb seemed unchanged. The paintings remained beautiful. The corridors remained cool. The work continued. Yet subtle signs of tension were becoming easier to notice. Not fear. Not panic. Simply awareness. Conversations about supplies occurred more often. Administrators spent more time reviewing records. Supervisors held longer discussions. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest that challenges persisted. During a midday break, the apprentice sat with several older craftsmen. The discussion eventually turned toward village history. One worker mentioned a famous painter from decades earlier. Another remembered a particularly skilled stonecutter. Then someone brought up the workers' protest from long ago. The apprentice immediately paid attention. The older craftsmen exchanged knowing looks. One of them nodded slowly. I remember hearing about it from my father. Another nodded as well. It changed things. The apprentice listened carefully. The conversation revealed only fragments. Small pieces of a larger story. Yet those fragments painted an interesting picture. The workers had not demanded luxury. They had not sought power. They had simply wanted the supplies they had earned. The fairness they had been promised. The idea seemed almost impossible to argue against. As the break ended, everyone returned to work. The lamps flickered. Tools struck stone. Paint covered walls. The tomb continued growing. But now the apprentice saw something he had not fully seen before. The beauty surrounding him existed because workers made it possible. And those workers were not merely laborers. They were people whose needs mattered. People whose voices mattered. People whose cooperation mattered. The tomb could not exist without them. That truth seemed obvious once noticed. Yet it was easy to forget when focusing only on kings and monuments. As evening approached, sunlight poured across the valley one final time. The cliffs glowed with warm golden light. The workers gathered their tools. Another day had ended. Another chapter of the tomb had been completed. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the horizon of ordinary days, the apprentice would soon learn the rest of the story. The story of how the workers acted together. The story of what happened when patience finally reached its limit. The story that would become one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of ancient labor. But for now, the village remained peaceful. The stars waited above. The desert waited below. And the story continued, one quiet evening at a time. The morning arrived softly over the desert. A pale ribbon of light stretched across the horizon, slowly brightening the world. The cliffs emerged from darkness. The cool air lingered for a little while longer. And throughout the workers' village, another day quietly began. The young apprentice woke before dawn, as he always did. For a few moments, he remained still. The room was silent. Outside, he could hear faint sounds as neighbors prepared for the day ahead. A door opening. Footsteps on packed earth. The distant murmur of voices. The ordinary sounds of ordinary lives. There was comfort in those sounds. Comfort in routine. Comfort in knowing that many things remained unchanged. Yet lately, the apprentice had begun noticing how fragile routines could be. A delayed shipment. A poor harvest somewhere far away. A decision made by officials hundreds of miles distant. Small events could ripple outward, eventually reaching even this quiet village hidden among the desert hills. After a simple breakfast, he joined the other workers on the familiar path to the valley. The eastern sky glowed softly behind them. Ahead stood the cliffs. Silent. Patient. Unmoving. They had watched generations come and go. They had seen workers arrive as boys and leave as old men. They had witnessed countless seasons. Countless kings. Countless stories. And now they watched another generation of craftsmen continue the work. Inside the tomb, the day began much as every other. Lamps were lit. Tools were gathered. Assignments were given. The steady rhythm of labor returned. The apprentice spent much of the morning assisting an experienced artist. The chamber they worked in had progressed significantly during recent months. The walls were almost completely decorated. The colors seemed to glow in the flickering lamplight. Scenes of gods, sacred journeys, and offerings stretched across every surface. The apprentice admired the work. Yet he also understood something he had not understood when he first arrived in the valley. The paintings themselves were only the final layer. Beneath them existed years of effort. Stonecutters had carved the chamber. Laborers had removed debris. Plasterers had prepared the walls. Pigment makers had created the colors. Every finished image rested upon countless unseen tasks. The tomb was a monument not only to a king. It was also a monument to cooperation. Around midday, work paused briefly. The workers gathered in shaded areas to eat. As often happened now, conversations eventually drifted toward supplies. The delayed deliveries remained a topic of concern. The most recent shipment had helped. But questions lingered. Would the next shipment arrive on time? Would the pattern continue? No one knew. One elderly craftsman slowly tore a piece of bread and spoke quietly. The problem with uncertainty is not knowing how long it will last. Several others nodded. The apprentice listened carefully. Older workers rarely wasted words. When they spoke, their observations often carried weight. The conversation gradually shifted toward memories of the past. Stories from earlier years. Stories from previous projects. Stories from the generations before them. The apprentice noticed that history lived within these workers. Not in books. Not on monuments. In people. The older craftsmen carried memories that younger workers had never experienced. Those memories formed a bridge between generations. As the afternoon passed, the apprentice continued working. The chamber slowly became more complete. Another section of artwork took shape. Another small piece of the tomb moved closer to its final form. The progress felt satisfying. Steady. Meaningful. Yet the story his father had begun telling remained in the back of his mind. The workers who had acted together. The workers who had finally decided enough was enough. The apprentice wanted to understand. Not because he expected the same thing to happen now. Because the story seemed important. The older workers spoke of it differently than they spoke of ordinary events. Almost with respect. Almost with pride. That evening, after returning home, he found his father repairing a wooden stool outside their house. The sun was sinking toward the horizon. The village glowed with warm golden light. Children played nearby. Neighbors talked quietly. The familiar evening scene unfolded around them. The apprentice sat beside his father. For a while they worked in silence. Then the older man finally spoke. "You have been thinking about the story?" It was not a question. The apprentice smiled. "Yes." His father nodded. "I thought so." The stool repair continued for several moments. Then the story resumed. The workers waited a long time. The apprentice listened closely. Longer than many people realize. The older man's voice remained calm. The supplies were delayed. Promises were made. More promises followed. The apprentice imagined the frustration. Not sudden anger. Not dramatic conflict. Something slower. Something heavier. The exhaustion of waiting. The workers continued doing their jobs, his father said. They wanted to believe the situation would improve. The apprentice nodded. That sounded exactly right. The people of the village were patient by nature. Patience formed part of their identity. But eventually, his father continued, their families began suffering. The words hung in the evening air. The apprentice looked toward the neighboring houses. He imagined parents trying to feed children. He imagined storage jars becoming emptier. He imagined uncertainty growing day after day. Suddenly the story felt much more real. These were not abstract events. These were families. Real people. The workers met together, his father said. They talked. They discussed what should be done. The apprentice leaned forward slightly. And his father smiled. And they made a decision. Again he stopped. The apprentice laughed. You are doing this on purpose. His father laughed as well. Perhaps. The older man looked toward the darkening sky. Stories should breathe. The apprentice could not argue with that. The best stories unfolded gradually. Like life itself. As darkness settled across the village, lamps began glowing inside homes. The stars emerged overhead. The desert cooled. Another peaceful evening arrived. Yet the apprentice now found himself looking at the village differently. Every family around him depended upon stability. Every household depended upon the supplies that arrived from outside. Every worker carried responsibilities beyond the tomb. The royal tomb mattered. But life mattered more. The realization felt important. Perhaps that was why the story remained remembered after all these years. Not because it involved conflict. Because it involved ordinary people protecting their families. The next day brought another journey into the valley. The work continued. The tomb continued. Yet subtle signs suggested that administrators remained concerned. More records were reviewed. More discussions took place among supervisors. More attention focused on inventories. The workers noticed. They always noticed. Still, nobody panicked. Life carried on. Ancient communities learned long ago that worry alone solved nothing. Work continued because work needed to continue. One task after another. One day after another. As afternoon approached, the apprentice passed through an older completed chamber. He paused briefly. The paintings looked beautiful. Timeless. Almost untouched by the years. He wondered about the workers who had created them. What worries had filled their minds? What conversations had they shared during meal breaks? What hopes had they carried home each evening? History often preserved finished monuments. Rarely did it preserve the people behind them. Yet somehow, through stories and memories, traces remained. The apprentice found comfort in that thought. And as the day's work finally ended, the workers once again emerged from the tomb and stepped into the golden light of the desert evening. The valley stretched before them. The village waited in the distance. And the story of the workers who had once stood together was moving closer to its most important chapter. A chapter that would reveal just how powerful ordinary people could become when they acted not out of anger, but out of patience, dignity, and unity. But that chapter still lay ahead. For now, the workers simply began the familiar walk home beneath the fading Egyptian sun, unaware that history was quietly preparing another lesson for those willing to listen. The desert night passed peacefully. Stars drifted across the sky above the sleeping village. A cool breeze moved between the mud brick homes. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked briefly before silence returned. Most of the workers slept deeply. Their days were long. Their labor was demanding. Rest was never difficult to find after hours spent inside the tomb. The young apprentice slept as well, though his dreams were filled with corridors, painted walls, and unfinished stories. When dawn finally arrived, it came slowly. The first pale light touched the distant horizon. The darkness softened. The outlines of houses became visible once again. And throughout the village, another day began. The apprentice followed his usual routine. A simple meal. A few quiet words with his family. Then the familiar walk toward the valley. The path seemed almost timeless now. The same stones. The same cliffs. The same desert wind. Generations of workers had walked this route. Some had done so for decades. Some for entire lifetimes. The apprentice often imagined the countless footprints that had crossed this ground before his own. Thousands upon thousands of journeys. Each one beginning at dawn. Each one ending at sunset. Each one part of a much larger story. As the workers entered the valley, the cliffs glowed softly beneath the morning sun. The tomb awaited them. Silent. Patient. Hidden within the rock. Work began immediately. The familiar sounds soon filled the chambers. The tap of chisels. The scrape of tools. The murmur of voices. The flicker of oil lamps. The rhythm felt almost comforting. Predictable. Reliable. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, small concerns continued growing. The apprentice noticed it more clearly now. Conversations about supplies occurred more often. Supervisors held longer discussions. Administrators reviewed records with increasing attention. Nothing dramatic had happened. But uncertainty had become part of daily life. And uncertainty has a way of slowly changing the atmosphere around people. Not all at once. Little by little. Like a shadow gradually lengthening across the ground. That afternoon, while helping transport materials through one of the older corridors, the apprentice found himself working beside Hori again. The older craftsman seemed thoughtful. More thoughtful than usual. For a while they worked in silence. Then Hori spoke. "Do you know why this village survived for so many years?" The apprentice considered the question. "Because the workers are skilled." Hori nodded. "That is part of it." They continued walking. Then Hori added another answer. "Because people trust each other." The apprentice looked at him. The older man smiled. "A village cannot survive without trust." The words seemed simple. Yet the apprentice sensed their importance. Trust connected everything. Workers trusted craftsmen. Families trusted workers. Villagers trusted one another. Without trust, even the strongest walls could not hold a community together. The conversation stayed with him throughout the rest of the day. And later, As the workers made their journey home beneath the golden evening light, he found himself observing the village more carefully than before. Children helping younger siblings. Neighbors sharing food. Families repairing homes together. Acts of trust appeared everywhere. Small acts. Ordinary acts. Yet they formed the foundation of community life. That evening, after the meal was finished and darkness settled over the desert, the apprentice joined his father outside once again. The stars shone brilliantly overhead. The air felt cool and pleasant. Around them, the village grew quieter with each passing moment. The apprentice knew the story would continue. His father knew it too. For a while neither spoke. Then, at last, the older man resumed. The workers made a decision. The apprentice leaned forward slightly. They would no longer remain silent. His father's voice remained calm. Steady. They did not gather weapons. The apprentice nodded. That would have seemed completely out of character. They did not threaten anyone. Again, that sounded right. The workers were craftsmen. Builders. Artists. Not warriors. So what did they do? The apprentice asked. His father smiled softly. They walked away. The apprentice blinked. Walked away. His father nodded. One day, instead of continuing their labor, they left the worksite together. The apprentice remained silent. The image formed in his mind. Stonecutters. Painters. Plasterers. Craftsmen. All walking away together. Not in anger. Not in violence. Simply refusing to continue until their concerns were addressed. For a moment, the apprentice struggled to imagine it. The tomb builders were known for dedication. For responsibility. For patience. The idea that they would stop working seemed extraordinary. Perhaps that was exactly why the event remained remembered. They were careful, his father continued. Very careful. The apprentice listened closely. The workers respected their responsibilities. The older man looked toward the dark outline of the cliffs in the distance. But they also believed that their families deserved food. The words felt impossible to argue against. A long silence followed. The stars continued shining overhead. The desert remained still. Finally, the apprentice spoke. What happened next? His father smiled. The officials were surprised. That answer made sense. Very few people expected workers like these to stop. Their community had earned a reputation for discipline and reliability. When such people acted together, others paid attention. The officials listened. The apprentice thought about that. Perhaps that was the most remarkable part. Not that the workers stopped. That someone listened afterward. The story paused again. Not because his father wished to tease him. Because the details deserved time. The story unfolded slowly. Just as it had happened. One step at a time. One decision at a time. One conversation at a time. The apprentice found himself appreciating that pace. History often seemed larger than life. But real events rarely happened that way. Real events unfolded gradually. Built from countless small moments. Just like the tomb itself. The next morning arrived with another sunrise. Another walk through the desert. Another workday inside the valley. Yet the apprentice now carried a new understanding. The workers who came before him were not merely craftsmen. They were people who understood their own worth. People who knew that skill carried value. People who believed that promises should be honored. As he worked, he began looking at the older craftsmen differently. Many of them descended from families who had lived in the village for generations. Their fathers had worked here. Their grandfathers. Perhaps even their great-grandfathers. The history of the village lived within them. Not just the history of tombs. The history of people. During a midday break, several workers discussed recent deliveries. The latest shipment had arrived. But once again it had been delayed. The pattern continued. The apprentice noticed how carefully everyone listened. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody became angry. Yet concern remained present. The memory of past difficulties lingered. The story his father was telling no longer felt distant. It felt relevant. Not because the village faced the exact same situation. Because the lesson remained important. Communities depended upon fairness. Trust depended upon reliability. When those things weakened, people eventually responded. As afternoon turned into evening, the workers completed another day of labor. The tomb continued growing. Its walls became more beautiful. Its chambers more complete. The project moved steadily forward. And as the sun descended behind the western hills, painting the cliffs in warm shades of gold and amber, the workers once again began the familiar walk home. The apprentice walked quietly beside Hori. Neither spoke for some time. The desert itself seemed to encourage silence. Finally, Hori glanced toward the distant village. "Every stone in that tomb matters," he said. The apprentice nodded. "Yes." Hori smiled gently. "But never forget." The older craftsman looked toward the lights beginning to appear among the houses. "The people matter more." The apprentice carried those words home with him. And somewhere deep inside, he knew they would remain with him for the rest of his life. For the story of the royal tomb builders was never truly about stone. It was about people. And the deeper he traveled into that story, the more clearly he began to understand that truth. The following days passed beneath clear desert skies. Morning after morning, the workers followed the familiar path through the valley. The cliffs stood unchanged. The tomb waited patiently. The sounds of labor echoed through the stone corridors just as they had the day before, and the day before that. To an outsider, life might have seemed completely unchanged. Yet the apprentice was beginning to notice details he once overlooked. The older workers paid close attention to deliveries. Administrators spent long hours examining records. Supervisors discussed matters quietly among themselves. The village still felt peaceful. But beneath that peace flowed an undercurrent of awareness. People were watching. Listening. Remembering. And perhaps that was why the story his father was telling felt so important. It was not merely a story about the past. It was a memory carried forward by the community. A lesson preserved across generations. A reminder of what could happen when ordinary people stood together. One afternoon, while working inside a partially completed chamber, the apprentice found himself alone with one of the oldest craftsmen in the village. The man was called Mena. His back was slightly bent with age. His beard had long since turned white. His hands bore the marks of decades spent shaping stone. Yet his eyes remained bright. Very bright. When Mena spoke, younger workers listened. Not because he demanded respect. Because he had earned it. The apprentice helped organize tools while Mena inspected a section of wall. For a while they worked in silence. Then the old craftsman suddenly asked a question. "Do you know how long it takes to build a good tomb?" The apprentice smiled. "Many years." Mena nodded. "Yes." Then he added something unexpected. And how long does it take to build a good community? The apprentice paused. He had never considered that question. The old craftsman answered before he could. A lifetime. The words hung in the air. Mena gently brushed stone dust from his hands. A tomb is built from stone. He looked around the chamber. A community is built from people. The apprentice thought about that long after the conversation ended. The workers often spoke about craftsmanship, about patience, about skill. Yet more and more, he found himself hearing another theme. Community. Trust. Responsibility. Perhaps those qualities matter just as much as technical skill. Maybe even more. As the afternoon continued, the workers made steady progress. The chamber slowly changed beneath their hands. A rough section became smooth. An unfinished wall became prepared for decoration. Small improvements accumulated. One after another. Just as they always had. That evening, the apprentice returned home feeling tired but content. The village welcomed him with familiar sights. Children playing. Families preparing meals. Neighbors talking beneath the fading sunlight. Life seemed ordinary. Comfortably ordinary. Yet as darkness settled and the stars emerged overhead, his father resumed the story once again. The apprentice almost smiled before the older man even spoke. He had been waiting all day. The officials listened, his father said quietly. The apprentice nodded. That was where the story had ended the night before. The workers explained their concerns. The older man looked up at the stars. They spoke calmly. The apprentice could easily imagine that. The workers were not reckless people. Their strength came from patience. Not from anger. They explained that their families needed food. The village around them grew quieter as lamps dimmed inside nearby homes. They explained that promises had not been kept. The apprentice listened carefully. And they explained that they could not continue forever without supplies. The story felt surprisingly modern despite its age. Not because circumstances were identical. Because human needs remained the same. People needed food, security, fair treatment. Those things rarely changed. What did the officials say? The apprentice asked. His father smiled slightly. At first, they offered explanations. The apprentice laughed softly. That sounded familiar. People often explained problems. Solving them was sometimes more difficult. They promised that supplies would arrive. The older man paused. The workers had heard promises before. The apprentice understood immediately. Promises carried value. But only when followed by action. For a while neither spoke. The stars glittered overhead. A cool breeze moved through the village. Finally, the father continued. What happened next became famous. The apprentice leaned forward. The older man smiled. Again he paused. Not for dramatic effect. Simply allowing the story room to breathe. The workers remained united. The apprentice nodded slowly. That seemed important. Very important. One worker alone could be ignored. A community acting together was much harder to dismiss. The lesson felt powerful. Not because it involved conflict. Because it involved cooperation. The workers succeeded through unity. Not through violence. Not through destruction. Through solidarity. Eventually the conversation drifted elsewhere. The story would continue another night. The apprentice no longer minded the slow pace. In many ways, the story reflected the village itself. patient, steady, deliberate. The next morning brought another sunrise, another journey through the desert, another day inside the tomb. Yet something interesting happened shortly after work began. A group of younger workers started discussing the history of the village. Someone mentioned famous craftsmen from earlier generations. Someone else recalled stories told by grandparents. Before long, a lively conversation spread through the chamber. The apprentice listened with interest. What struck him most was how often the same themes appeared: skill, patience, community, responsibility. Again and again, the village seemed built upon those values. Perhaps that was why it had endured for so long. Not because it possessed wealth. Not because it possessed power. Because people cared for one another. During the midday break, Hori joined the apprentice beneath a shaded section of rock. They shared bread and sat quietly for a while. Then Hori asked a question. "What have you learned recently?" The apprentice thought about it. There were many possible answers. Techniques, tools, materials. Yet none of those felt quite right. Finally he spoke. "I think the tomb exists because people work together." Hori smiled immediately. The apprentice knew he had chosen the right answer. The older craftsman nodded. Many young workers focus only on stone. He glanced toward the tomb entrance. They see walls, paintings, corridors. The apprentice listened. But the most important thing is the people. There it was again. The same lesson. Repeated in different words. Repeated by different voices. The apprentice was beginning to understand. The tomb builders viewed their work differently than outsiders might. The tomb mattered. Of course it mattered. But the community mattered more. Everything depended upon the community. Without it, there would be no tomb. As the afternoon wore on, the workers returned to their tasks. The familiar sounds filled the chambers. Tools striking stone. Brushes moving across walls. Footsteps echoing through corridors. The rhythm felt almost musical. Steady and reassuring. By evening, another section of work had been completed. The tomb moved one step closer to completion. The workers gathered their belongings. The long walk home began once more. Golden sunlight covered the valley. The desert air cooled gradually. And as the apprentice walked beside the others, he found himself looking around differently than before. The craftsmen surrounding him were no longer simply co-workers. They were part of a long chain stretching across generations. A chain connecting past workers to present workers. A chain connecting knowledge, traditions, and memories. The realization filled him with quiet pride. When he finally reached the village, the first stars were already appearing overhead. Another evening awaited. Another chapter of the story awaited. And somewhere within that story lay the moment when the workers' unity would change their future. A moment drawing closer with every passing night. A moment that would reveal just how strong a community could become when it remembered that every person mattered. And beneath the vast Egyptian sky, as darkness slowly settled across the village once again, the apprentice continued his journey not only toward becoming a skilled craftsman, but toward understanding the deeper history of the people who built the royal tombs. The desert greeted the village with another quiet dawn. The eastern horizon slowly brightened, washing the sky with pale shades of silver and gold. Shadows retreated from the narrow streets. Clay lamps flickered out one by one. The cool air of night lingered briefly before surrendering to the warmth of the coming day. The workers rose as they always had. There was something almost timeless about these mornings. A person could imagine that the same routine had unfolded yesterday, and the day before, and years before that. Generations of tomb builders had awakened beneath these skies. Generations had prepared simple meals, gathered their tools, walked toward the valley. The apprentice often thought about that now. The people who came before him no longer felt distant. Their lives seemed woven into the landscape itself, into the paths, into the houses, into the cliffs, even into the stone of the tomb. As he joined the other workers heading toward the valley, the first sunlight touched the tops of the cliffs. The rock glowed softly. The desert appeared calm and endless. No matter how many times he made this journey, the sight never completely lost its beauty. The valley possessed a quiet dignity. Not the beauty of gardens or rivers. A different beauty. A beauty born from silence and age. The workers entered the tomb. The familiar darkness welcomed them. Oil lamps were lit. Tools were gathered. Work began. Inside one chamber, artists continued painting sacred scenes. In another, stonecutters shaped newly excavated walls. Elsewhere, plasterers prepared surfaces for future decoration. The entire tomb functioned like a living thing. Each worker performed a task connected to countless others. One effort supported another. One skill depended upon another. The apprentice found comfort in that rhythm. The work felt meaningful. Not because it brought wealth. Not because it brought fame. Because it contributed to something larger than any single person. As the morning passed, he worked alongside Hori once again. The older craftsman seemed unusually thoughtful. Eventually, while examining a section of wall, he spoke. "When I was young, I thought skill was the most important thing." The apprentice listened. Hori smiled slightly. "Then I became older." The apprentice waited. "And I learned that reliability matters more." The words seemed simple. Yet, as always, there was wisdom beneath them. A skilled worker who could not be trusted created problems. A reliable worker helped everyone. The apprentice nodded. He understood. The village depended upon reliable people. Reliable workers. Reliable families. Reliable deliveries. Reliable promises. Everything connected. Everything depended upon trust. By midday, the workers gathered for a meal break. The shade was limited, but they made the best of it. Bread was shared. Water passed from hand to hand. Conversations drifted through the warm air. The apprentice noticed that discussions about supplies had become almost routine. Not because people enjoyed discussing them. Because uncertainty remained. The latest shipments had arrived. Yet concerns persisted. One older craftsman quietly observed that delayed deliveries often created more problems than shortages themselves. The apprentice found that interesting. When someone knew supplies would be scarce, they could prepare. Uncertainty was different. Uncertainty left people waiting. Wondering. Hoping. The workers understood that all too well. After the break ended, labor resumed. Hours passed slowly inside the tomb. The lamps flickered. Stone dust drifted through the air. The familiar sounds continued their steady rhythm. And while the apprentice worked, his thoughts occasionally returned to his father's story. The workers who had acted together. The workers who had refused to remain silent. The workers whose decision was still remembered generations later. He was beginning to understand why the story mattered. It was not merely a tale of disagreement. It was a story about dignity. about ordinary people recognizing their own value. As evening approached, the workers left the tomb and began the walk home. The desert had changed once again. The harsh brightness of midday was gone. Soft golden light covered the valley. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The cliff seemed almost peaceful. The apprentice walked beside Mena, the elderly craftsman. For a while they remained silent. Then the old man spoke unexpectedly. "Do you know what survives the longest?" The apprentice thought. "The tombs." Mena smiled. "A long time." Then he shook his head. "Not the longest." The apprentice waited. "Stories." The old craftsman looked toward the horizon. "Stone eventually breaks. Paint eventually fades. But stories can travel forever if people continue telling them." The apprentice considered that. The story his father was telling had already survived generations. Perhaps Mena was right. Perhaps stories possessed a different kind of endurance. When they reached the village, evening life had already begun. Families gathered outside their homes. Children laughed and played. Neighbors exchanged news. The scent of cooking food drifted through the warm air. The familiar scene felt comforting. No matter what concerns existed beyond the village, life continued. Meals needed preparing. Homes needed maintaining. Families needed caring for. These ordinary tasks formed the foundation of everything else. That night, after dinner, the apprentice joined his father beneath the stars once more. The older man seemed to know exactly why he had come. The story waited between them. Patiently. Just as it had every evening. For a while they watched the sky. Then his father resumed. The workers remained united. The apprentice nodded. That part of the story had already become clear. The officials realized the situation could not continue. The older man's voice remained soft. Calm. Measured. They understood that the workers were serious. The apprentice listened closely. The village around him had grown quiet. Only an occasional voice drifted through the darkness. "What happened then?" he asked. His father smiled. The officials finally acted. The apprentice felt a small sense of satisfaction. The story was moving forward. Promises were one thing. Action was another. Supplies were gathered. The older man continued. Deliveries were organized. The apprentice imagined the relief spreading through the workers' community. Not celebration. Relief. The simple relief of knowing that families would be fed. That obligations would be honored. That concerns had been heard. The workers returned to their tasks. His father paused. They had achieved what they wanted. The apprentice thought about that carefully. The goal had never been power. Never been conflict. Simply fairness. That distinction felt important. Very important. The workers had not acted because they hated their work. They had acted because they valued their families. Because they valued their community. Because they believed promises should matter. The lesson seemed timeless. For a while neither spoke. The stars glittered overhead. A cool breeze moved through the village. Finally, the apprentice asked a question. Why is the story still remembered? His father smiled. Because he had clearly hoped the question would come. The story survives because it reminds us of something. The apprentice listened. The tombs were important. The older man looked toward the distant cliffs. The kings were important. He paused. But the workers were important too. The words settled gently into the night air. The apprentice understood. Perhaps for the first time, he truly understood. History often focused on rulers, on monuments, on treasures. Yet behind every monument stood ordinary people. People whose labor made everything possible. People whose names were often forgotten, yet whose contributions remained everywhere. The story survived because it reminded future generations of that truth. The workers mattered. Their lives mattered. Their families mattered. Their voices mattered. And as the apprentice sat beneath the stars, listening to the quiet sounds of the sleeping village, he felt a deeper connection to the community around him. Not just to the work. Not just to the tomb. To the people. The generations who came before. The workers beside him now. The apprentices who would come after. Together they formed the true story of the royal tomb builders. A story far richer than stone alone could ever tell. And while the tomb continued growing within the valley, another kind of monument continued growing as well. A monument built from memory, from community, from shared experience. A monument that lived not in stone chambers, but in the hearts of the people who called the village home. And under the endless Egyptian sky, that story quietly continued. The years continued to pass over the workers' village. The sun rose above the desert cliffs. The sun set beyond the distant horizon. The Nile continued its long journey through Egypt. And life moved forward, just as it always had. The young apprentice who once walked nervously into the royal tomb each morning did not remain young forever. Little by little, season after season, he grew into a skilled craftsman. The lessons of Hori stayed with him. The wisdom of Mena stayed with him. The stories of his father stayed with him. And most importantly, the understanding that every stone in the tomb carried the effort of countless people stayed with him. Years passed. New apprentices arrived. The apprentice became a teacher. The same way others had once taught him. He showed younger workers how to prepare materials, how to recognize mistakes, how to work patiently, how to respect the craft. And sometimes, during quiet evenings beneath the stars, he told stories. The same stories that had been passed down to him. Stories about the workers who built the royal tombs. Stories about friendship. About responsibility. About community. And about the day when ordinary workers stood together and reminded the kingdom that their labor mattered. The royal tomb itself slowly approached completion. Chamber after chamber was finished. Paintings covered walls with sacred scenes. Corridors stretched deep into the mountain. Colors glowed beneath the light of oil lamps. The work of thousands of hands became one unified creation. Yet even as the tomb neared its final form, the workers understood something important. The tomb would never truly belong to one person alone. Not entirely. It would belong partly to every craftsman who touched it. Every painter. Every stone cutter. Every plasterer. Every laborer. Every scribe. Every apprentice. Their names might not appear upon the walls. Their faces might never be carved into stone. But their presence lived within every corridor. Every line. Every brush stroke. Every carefully shaped block of rock. The years continued flowing onward. Some workers grew old. Some passed away. New generations took their places. Children became apprentices. Apprentices became masters. Masters became elders. The cycle continued. The village endured. Through good years. Through difficult years. Through changes in rulers. Through changes in fortunes. The community survived because it had always been built upon something stronger than stone. It was built upon people. Neighbors helping neighbors. Families supporting one another. Knowledge shared from one generation to the next. Trust. Patience. Responsibility. These things could not be carved into a wall. Yet they were the true foundation of the village. One evening, many years after first hearing his father's stories, the former apprentice sat outside his home beneath a sky filled with stars. The desert was quiet. The air was cool. The familiar cliffs stood in darkness beyond the village. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Families shared evening meals. The sounds were gentle, comforting, timeless. He found himself thinking about all those who had come before him. The craftsmen whose names had faded from memory. The workers whose footsteps had disappeared beneath the desert sands. The people who spent their lives creating something they would never fully see completed. And yet their work remained. Not only in the tomb, in the village, in the traditions, in the stories, in the people who followed after them. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the royal tomb builders. Not merely the monuments they created, but the communities they built, the knowledge they preserved, the dignity they carried, the example they left behind. Far away, hidden within the cliffs, the royal tomb rested in silence. Its painted walls glowed softly in darkness. Its corridors waited patiently. Its chambers preserved the labor of generations. The kings buried within such tombs would be remembered. Historians would speak of them. Travelers would seek them. Their names would survive. But the workers deserved remembrance too. The men and women whose daily lives unfolded far from royal palaces. The people who woke before dawn. Who carried tools through the desert. Who shared bread with friends. Who returned home tired each evening. Who worried about their families. Who laughed together. Worked together. And stood together when necessary. Their story was quieter. Yet no less important. And so, as the years drifted into decades and the decades into centuries, the desert continued watching. The cliffs remained. The stars remained. The winds moved softly across the valley floor. Generations came and went. Empires rose and faded. But somewhere beneath the endless Egyptian sky, the memory of the royal tomb builders endured. A memory not of treasure. Not of power. Not of kings alone. But of ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary dedication. People who shaped stone. People who shaped history. And people who quietly proved that even the grandest monuments begin with simple human hands. The village eventually grew still beneath the night. Lamps faded one by one. Conversations ended. Doors closed. Families slept. Above them, countless stars filled the dark sky. The same stars their ancestors had watched. The same stars future generations would watch. And beneath that endless blanket of light, the story slowly faded into silence. Like footsteps disappearing across desert sand. Like the final glow of sunset on ancient stone. Like a calm evening settling gently over the Valley of the Kings. And there, in the quietness of the desert night, the workers rested. The tomb rested. The village rested. And the story came softly to its end.